Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. Um, if you enjoy this podcast, I would encourage you to go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review, help others see us. The more reviews we get, the more visible we are to the general public. So if you want to help out some friends, some families, people you don't know, go on and give us a review there. We just wrapped up a special promotion and we asked people to give us reviews. In exchange, we were offering 2 hours of my time, which again, might be very exciting to you, might be less exciting to you. So we did have a lot of people enter. Thank you so much. And I'm going to be announcing the winner in our next segment. But before we get to that, um, ACT versus SAT. And for those of you who are going to test, and I know that this coming year, maybe many of you may not be going to test, but if you are going to test, and for those of you who are underclassmen, for whom testing may become a more regular part of your life again, this is a big question. Which one do you choose? Do you just go with the SAT because everyone in your school seems to take the SAT, or do you do the reverse and just go with the ACT because that's what everyone around you does? I would encourage you not to go that way, but to instead figure out which one is right for you. And joining us today is Megan Stubendeck, who is CEO of Arbor Bridge, also a former tutor and a curriculum leader. So really an expert on these choices. And I am going to put a small plug in for Arbor Bridge. We send lots of students to Arbor Bridge. They do great work with our students. And I am, in fact, a client. So my own son is working with a tutor from Arbor Bridge on he is choosing the SAT, but he did a diagnostic, so we knew which one was right. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks for having me. And for everyone listening out there, it's great to be with you today.
Absolutely. Okay, so why don't we start with the basics? So there are some general differences between the two tests. Walk us through those, please.
So one thing that's similar is that they both test content you know from school. And that is one thing that you're going to find on either one. All that stuff you learned in math class in ninth grade and eighth grade is going to come back and haunt you on both of these exams. But like
Yes.
you said, Beth, there's a little bit of a difference too. And I think the best way to think about it is both in pace and experience, kind of what is it that the feel of the test is like. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the pace of the SAT is a bit slower, where the ACT is a little faster. So what I mean by that is that you just have more time per question on the SAT than you do for the ACT. But
Yes.
I do want to say, it's not to say that you're going to take the SAT and feel like you're on a spa day and everything is going to be really leisurely. It is still a fast-paced exam, but it's just slightly slower than the ACT would be.
Got it.
Yeah. And the other big difference is that experience. It's sort of the content. Like, what is it they're actually asking you to do on the test? And I think the big difference here is the SAT is all about analysis, really digging deep into a passage, reading passage, or a math question that's really wordy and sets up this convoluted experience of someone is pouring concrete in a patio and all of these things are happening. And then you have to kind of find the math inside there,
Yep.
where the ECT is just come in here, get right to the point. They just want you to read as fast as you can, regurgitate the information, and push through all of those math equations as you're going. So those are really the two big differences for most students.
Right. And it strikes me as you describe the differences. So I also have a stepson who has already graduated college. He took the ACT. My son, as I mentioned, has taken the SAT. And as you describe the differences, I would say it seems to perfectly align with their personalities. And I never really thought about it that way until I heard you just now describing it. And I thought, yeah, well, that's like absolutely Jack. And that's absolutely Ryan. So that's so funny that it did kind of line up that way. I will say it probably doesn't always line up that way, but it's funny to me anyway that it did. So that's a really great kind of overview of the general differences. Why don't we do kind of a deeper dive into each of them? You presented some of this information to our whole team a few weeks ago, and we loved it so much that I said, let's do this on the podcast. But one of the things I loved was this idea that the SAT is the slow analytical test and the ACT is the accelerated content test. But I just wanted to throw that out there for our listeners because I think that's really cute. But let's talk about the grammar reading and the differences in both in that section.
So actually, when it comes to grammar section, which is the sections of the exam on the ACT, it's called the English section.
Mhm.
On the SAT, the grammar section is called the writing and language section. So nice mouthful there.
Yes.
There actually isn't much of a difference between the two tests. They're pretty much the same. So for most students, they don't really need to worry about which one is going to be a better fit when it comes to that section of the test. But when it comes to reading, there is a big difference. And so for the reading section of the SAT, again, it's these really long passages where students are asked not just questions at the end of the passage that just say, oh, do you remember when did the boy go to the store? Or when did this happen? It actually asks you to make a lot of inferences about what do you think the author meant by
Mm.
line 15 through 16. So you really have to sit through it, think through it. Where the ACT is just going to ask you a lot of factual recall questions, really to move you at a quicker pace. And so that's the big difference in the reading. I think the other big difference that people are starting to notice is when the SAT was rewritten a couple of years ago, they started to use a lot of old passages. So passages from the 1700s, from 1800s, stuff that,
Yeah.
actually sounds really different than the way we think and read and talk today. And so that can make the SAT a little bit more daunting for a student who maybe isn't used to kind of that exposure. ACT, it's all modern. It's mostly passages from the last 50 or 60 years.
Got it. And that is what's so tricky about that, the older passages is I'm a big reader. I was an English major in college, and I try to kind of mix up how I read, right? So I might read something that's very contemporary, then a beach read that is not require a whole lot of thinking, and then I will often read a classic. And I always am interested in how I need a little bit to get into the classic because the way that the writing is done, it's different. The speech patterns are different, the language is different, and how it takes me a while to get into that. And you don't have a while on the SAT, right? You have a little bit longer than you do on the ACT, but you don't have a lot of time to get your head into that style of writing. So I can imagine that that would be tricky, especially for a student who's not really a reader
Yeah,
necessarily.
absolutely. Because you only have not only just a short amount of time, but you don't have a lot of passage either. You only have 60 lines or so of the passage to really kind of find the flow. And so that's actually where preparing, whether you're doing it on your own or you're doing it with someone like Arbor Bridge, is going to help because you'll expose yourself to a lot of the types of passages
Hmm.
that come up. And we have this on our blog. We have an SAT, ACT reading in our library section where it's got links to the types of passages you're going to see. So you can at least start to get a sense of what are the themes that often show up, sort of what are the authors they like to source from. They kind of do use the same types of authors over and over for those older passages. And so you at least can kind of get that footing in your preparation work. So when it comes test day, you're like, oh, okay, I know this. I can really get into it, get my hooks into it before I get, lose too much time.
Yeah, and actually, I love that idea. And I also like that you've mentioned your blog because much like our blog, there's so much really good, helpful information in the blog. So while you may not have it in the budget to pay for working specifically with a college coach counselor or to have an Arbor Bridge tutor, we are providing free resources so that hopefully you can benefit from the work that we are doing and understanding who the authors that they pull from are. Maybe you can spend some time reading those passages in advance of going in so that, like me, trying to get into a book that was written at a different time, you could kind of get your head into that a little bit more quickly by being more familiar with it. So I love that idea. Definitely check out the Arbor Bridge blog. All right, so what about the math section? What are the big differences there?
Yeah. So one thing that they have in common is that when we kind of look at the courses that students generally take in high school when it comes to math, it's algebra 1, geometry, then algebra 2, and then trig and pre-calc. That's pretty much the flow most students will take. Algebra 2 is really the sort of heavy hitter on both tests. It makes up about 50% or even sometimes a little bit more in the case
Mm.
of the SAT. It makes up 50% of the questions that you're going to see on the test. So if you have taken Algebra 2, or maybe you're partway through, 3/4 of the way through that course, it is a good time for you to take the SAT or the ACT. And so having that sort of under your belt is great. The one difference I would say in content is sort of those old classes you took the years before, Algebra 1 and geometry. Which one is the most important on the two exams? And I would say for SAT, it's actually Algebra 1.
Mm.
And the reason that I say that is that even though 50% of the SAT really does, or it's actually closer to 60, is Algebra 2, Algebra 1 skills, the sort of basic math reasoning skills in algebra you learned in Algebra 1,
Hmm.
apply to 80% of the test of the questions. It might be an Algebra 2 question, but it involves some of the things you learned in Algebra 1. And so that Algebra 1 foundation or review, if you need a little bit of review because you're a little rusty, it's 2 or 3 years ago,
Yes.
that's going to be really important for SAT. On the flip side, ACT, the review category that becomes really important is geometry. Geometry makes up a quarter of the ACT questions. And because of that, that's a pretty heavy hitter right behind. It's the largest portion behind Algebra 2. So if it's been a long time since you memorize the volume of a right cylinder, which many people do not know it, and I will not not bore you with it here.
No idea.
And most people do. They forget it. They take that geometry course and they do that quiz or test in January of sophomore year, and they will never touch it again except for the ACT. So those things will come back again to haunt you. That geometry course does if you choose ACT. So just kind of knowing that those two categories of those two classes are going to come back in different ways on the two tests, I think is an important thing to keep in mind between when you choose between the two.
Yeah, no, well, and also if you're a student who struggled in geometry, but really the algebra, both 1 and 2, really you got that a little bit more, then that might be a sign that the SAT could be better for you than the ACT. And then of course the reverse is true, right? If you really enjoyed geometry and thought it was good, and also similarly were fine with algebra 1 and 2, then the ACT could be a perfect fit. So I like that we're kind of talking more nuance here, because what I do find is a lot of times students will do the diagnostic and it won't necessarily be clear. There won't be a clear winner. There was for my son, and interestingly, there was for my best friend's son, also did a diagnostic, and there was a clear winner for him as well. But I often find that students, they may do a little bit better on one than on the other, but often it comes down to how you feel about the test. I enjoyed this experience a little more than that one, as much as you enjoy a standardized test ever, right? But I like that the nuance here can maybe go beyond just feeling and more into, and I know that this is a good skill set for me, and therefore this is probably the better test.
Absolutely.
So, all right, science. Interesting here is science isn't really on the SAT, right? So, but there is a section on the ACT.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the one that everyone gravitates towards. It's like, oh, ACT is the one. If you're a science kid, you need to take the ACT or you will be better at the ACT. That's not necessarily true. And the first thing I'll see about that is that the ACT section on science doesn't test science facts. It's not a physics test where you have to remember every equation in physics. And if you've never taken physics, you will fail that section. That is absolutely not what it's about. It's more of a scavenger hunt test or a data test of they ask you questions about data they give you in charts and graphs or in a passage, and then you have to apply that data or just regurgitate that data and just find it from the chart or graph. And so for some students, what I say is don't be automatically afraid of the ACT because you don't think you're a science kid. If you're good at data, if you're good at graphs, it actually might be a really comfortable exam for you. Again, Beth, this is going back to what you said. Diagnostic tests are really helpful for this, to really get a sense of what does this section feel like. And then I will also sort of put a little plug in there is that SAT doesn't technically have a science section, but many of the other sections, the writing section, the math section, and the reading section actually do have charts and graphs where you are going to apply some of that very same sort of those sets of skills that you would use in the ACT science. So it's not necessarily that you're going to avoid it entirely, even if you take the SAT.
Got it. And I've heard the science section described as, and I can't believe I just said that, because if people have listened to this podcast really ever, they will know that one of my least favorite phrases in college admissions is, I've heard that, because it's almost always followed by a complete and total falsehood or a half truth that is now making the rounds as a hard fact, right? But that science in many ways in the science section on the ACT is a lot about critical reading, right? And what is your thought on that kind of, or describing it in that way?
Yeah, it is. It is a lot about critical reading. I think the other thing is that it's also about test strategy. It is one of the sections where if a student doesn't really know how to tackle it because there's a lot of information that students do have to sift through, and only 10% of it is even tested on the questions. If you really don't know how to kind of tackle that section, it can feel overwhelming and difficult. But it is one section that students can move quite a bit in if they just learn how to pick and choose how they spend their time in that section. So I think it's that sort of added skill as well.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, I think that's a great example, right? I had one little tidbit of information which is valid, but then there is a much bigger picture to that science section. And interestingly enough, when I work with students and they do decide to take the ACT, often it's the science section that they are most concerned about because it's the one that they tend to do not as well on when they do the diagnostic. Um, and it is the section that I see the scores rise almost the most because as you just pointed out, a lot of it is about strategy. So if you are preparing for that section, it's absolutely possible to do significantly better than maybe the very first time you ever laid eyes on it. And I've seen that play out again and again with students.
Absolutely. Yes.
In terms of exam timing, kind of the last big thing you mentioned that one is cramming a little bit more. The ACT is a faster pace. What are the exact times that students should be prepared for when they are working through the SAT or the ACT?
So now that the SAT has removed the essay part, if we kind of look at
Yay.
both the SAT and ACT, yeah, exactly. Yes, everyone, this is the greatest thing that ever happened.
Yes.
The SAT and ACT, if we look at both of them without essay, they're essentially the same length. SAT is 3 minutes and 17 seconds, and the ACT is 3 minutes and 10 seconds, or not 10 seconds, 10 minutes, three
Mhm.
hours. And I wish it were 3 minutes and 10
Yeah,
seconds.
exactly.
Yeah, 3 hours and 10 to 15 extra minutes. That's really what they're going to be both for each exam. So it's pretty much the same in terms of overall time commitment. But one thing that you'll notice is each of the sections has for each test. So the reading is a little bit longer reading section on the SAT than the ACT. So
Mhm.
that might, for we were talking about the field, that is one place where feel can be important, where you can kind of say like, ooh, I didn't like sitting for 65 minutes of reading. Not many students do. I prefer to do a 35-minute reading section, which is the ACT. So
Mhm.
that will be one place where your sort of experience of the diagnostic is going to tell you a lot.
Got it. Okay. Any last thoughts before we wrap up our segment?
No, I would just say I think you hit on the nail on the head when you said that diagnostic testing is really helpful and really powerful because you can't really know until you're in it, how it feels, how you're actually going to score, what those look like. We always do them for free at Arbor Bridge. You can always reach out to us and we'll do a diagnostic of each test for you and walk you through sort of the results and give recommendations. But at the very core of it is it's really about finding the right fit for you, and you will find that right fit.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Megan. And for our listeners, arborbridge.com, say you heard us on the podcast so that Megan knows that her time with us was well spent. We are going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, we're announcing the winner of our podcast review contest and we're going to be answering your questions. So don't go away.